Tuesday morning, coffee still hot in my hand, and my fence, the one I built myself, post by post, was sitting 7 feet inside my property line. Stapled to the new post, a laminated HOA notice. Property line adjusted for community aesthetic standards. I was still reading it when the white Lexus pulled up. She stepped out, blazer pressed, chin up, and looked at me like she was waiting for a thank you. "Mr. Harlow," she said.
"I think you'll find it looks much cleaner now."
"Gloriana," I said.
"You just moved 7 feet of my land."
She smiled, got back in the car, drove away. She'd done this to 4 other homeowners on this street. All 4 signed the papers and moved their fences. I wasn't the 5th. She had no idea she was about to lose the one thing that gave her power over this entire neighborhood. That grand front gate she'd controlled for 20 years. All of it. Gone. Where are you watching from? And has your HOA ever pulled something like this on you? Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what I did, you need to understand what I had. My name is Decker Harlow, and I have lived on Creosote Ridge Road in Mineral Springs, Colorado, a mid-sized town about 40 minutes east of Colorado Springs, for 11 years. I bought my house in my early 40s after a decade of contract welding work that took me through oil fields in Wyoming, pipeline corridors in Texas, and more frozen truck stops than I care to remember. When I finally came home to Colorado and put down roots, I didn't buy some cookie-cutter suburban box. I bought a corner lot, 3/4 of an acre, with a sloping backyard, mature cottonwood trees, and a detached workshop that I use to this day for custom metal fabrication work on the side. The house needed work. The bones were good, but the previous owners had let things go. Over 5 years, I rewired the garage, rebuilt the back deck, and put in a cedar privacy fence along the full eastern property line. That fence took me 3 weekends, 42 posts, and about $800 in materials. I knew exactly where my property line was, because I'd had the lot surveyed the summer before I started. The survey pins were right there in the ground, orange flagged and everything. The smell of fresh-cut cedar in August. That's what I remember most from those weekends. That, and the sound of my post driver ringing against the steel caps, neighbors waving from the sidewalk. It felt like the most honest work I'd done in years. Now, the Mineral Springs Heritage Homeowners Association, that's the full name, and yes, they insist on all 5 words, had been a low-grade nuisance since I moved in. Strongly worded letters about trash bin placement. A fine notice because my truck was parked in my own driveway at an angle they considered aesthetically inconsistent. Small stuff. Annoying, but small. The association's president was a woman named Gloriana Fitch, mid-60s, retired real estate broker, drove a white Lexus SUV, and wore the HOA board chairmanship like a crown she'd been waiting her entire life to receive. Gloriana had lived in the community for 22 years. She knew every clause of the CC&Rs, the way some people know scripture, selectively, and always in her favor. She did not like me. I was never entirely sure why, though I had my suspicions. I wasn't the kind of homeowner Gloriana envisioned when she thought about Creosote Ridge. I worked with my hands. I drove a truck with a welding rig in the bed. I had a workshop that occasionally produced the sound of an angle grinder at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. I didn't attend the quarterly wine and cheese HOA mixers, and I'd had the nerve, back in year 2, to formally dispute a fine on procedural grounds and win. She remembered that. So when Gloriana decided, in the spring of year 11, that my fence was encroaching on the HOA's designated buffer easement along the eastern edge of the common area, I shouldn't have been surprised. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It was 4 pages long, cited 6 different CC and R clauses, and informed me that the fence had to be relocated, inward, by no fewer than 7 feet, within 30 days, or the association would hire a contractor to do it and bill me. I read it twice. Then I went to my workshop, made a cup of coffee on the old camp stove I keep on the shelf by the drill press, and sat down to think. The gravel crunched under my boots. The cottonwoods were just starting to leaf out. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing. I thought, okay, Gloriana, let's see what you actually own. The first thing I did was not call a lawyer. The first thing I did was pull out the original survey report I'd commissioned 5 years earlier and lay it flat on my workbench next to the HOA's letter. Gloriana's letter kept referencing a buffer easement along the eastern property boundary, a strip of land, allegedly 12 feet wide, that the HOA claimed the right to maintain and access. According to them, my fence sat inside that easement and had to go. According to my survey, my property line ran exactly where I'd always believed it ran. There was no 7-foot gap between my fence and the boundary. The fence was, in fact, set back 18 inches from the surveyed line as a courtesy. But here was the thing. Easements are real legal instruments. They can exist even if you don't know about them. They get recorded at the county clerk's office, attached to the deed. And if one existed on my property, my original survey might not have flagged it depending on how it was recorded. So before I did anything else, I drove to the El Paso County Clerk and Recorder's office and paid $12 for a full title search on my parcel. I want you to remember that number, $12. For $12, I now had in my hands every recorded document attached to my property going back to 1987. Deed of trust, utility easements, drainage covenant, and yes, one HOA recorded easement, filed in 2003, pertaining to a 6-foot aesthetic maintenance buffer along the eastern border of lots 12 through 17 on Creosote Ridge Road. I am lot 19. Let me say that again clearly. The easement Gloriana Fitch cited in her 4-page letter did not apply to my lot. It had never applied to my lot. The HOA had filed a maintenance easement affecting specific lots in a specific section, and my lot sat 2 parcels outside that range. I printed the relevant page of the title abstract, circled lot 19's parcel number, and drove home. Now, a reasonable person at this point sends a polite letter back, attaches the documentation, and asks the HOA to review their records. I considered that. I genuinely did. But here's what stopped me. I had been here before, in a smaller way. 2 years prior, when I disputed that fine, I had sent the polite letter with the clean documentation. It had taken 4 months, 2 board meetings, and a threat to file a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate before Gloriana's board acknowledged the error. They had never apologized. They had simply stopped replying to that particular thread of correspondence. I decided that this time, I was going to let them make the first move, fully. Completely. I wanted them on record. So I did something that felt deeply counterintuitive. I wrote back and requested a formal hearing before the full HOA board to contest the fence relocation order. I sent the letter certified mail, return receipt requested, which is a small but important move because it creates a time-stamped legal record of when the HOA received my communication and who signed for it. Under Colorado's HOA dispute resolution statutes, once you formally request a hearing, the HOA is obligated to provide one within a reasonable time frame before taking enforcement action. Gloriana signed for the letter on a Wednesday morning. By Friday afternoon, I had received the board's response. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, but in the meantime, and here is where Gloriana made her first real mistake, the letter informed me that because the fence was in active violation, the HOA had retained the right to begin preliminary corrective work. Preliminary corrective work. I was in my workshop when I read that line, and the smell of machine oil and sawdust suddenly felt very sharp and very clarifying. She wasn't going to wait for the hearing. She was going to move first and let the process sort it out later. I called my neighbor Whitfield Oakes, Whit, who'd lived on Creosote Ridge for 15 years, who'd had his own dust-ups with the board, and who happened to be a retired civil engineer with a very good eye for property markers, and I asked him to come over with his transit level. We walked the fence line together. Whit set up his equipment. We measured. We photographed. We staked the survey pins with fresh orange flags. Then we waited. 3 days later, a crew in an unmarked white pickup showed up at 7 in the morning with a reciprocating saw and a post puller. They pulled 11 fence posts before I walked out of my front door with a copy of my title abstract, a printed copy of the Colorado Revised Statutes section on easement validity, and my phone recording video. "Morning," I said. "I'm going to need you to stop." The crew foreman, a heavy-set guy in a Carhartt jacket who looked like he genuinely did not want to be part of whatever this was, stopped the moment I held up the documents. He was a contractor, not a crusader. He pulled out his phone and called whoever had hired him. Gloriana arrived 12 minutes later in the white Lexus. It was 7:23 in the morning. She was in a blazer. "Mr. Harlow," she said, walking across my lawn like she owned it, and that detail was not lost on me. "This crew has authorization from the HOA board. You are obstructing an authorized maintenance action." I kept my phone pointed at her and smiled. "Gloriana, the easement you cited doesn't cover Lot 19. I have the county title abstract right here. Would you like to see it?" She didn't look at the paper. She looked at my phone. "You're being recorded?" "We both are," I said, and nodded toward the crew foreman, who had very wisely stepped back about 10 feet and was examining the sky. What followed was 4 minutes of Gloriana telling me that the HOA's own legal records superseded county filings, that I was being difficult, that the fence was an eyesore, and that she had the full support of the board. I said very little. I let her talk. Every single word was going on video. Eventually, she told the crew to pause and drove away. I called Mineral Springs Code Enforcement Office that same morning and filed a formal complaint documenting the unauthorized fence removal. Then I filed a second complaint with the Colorado HOA Information Office, a state office that fields complaints about HOA governance misconduct, attaching the video, the title abstract, and the HOA's enforcement letter. Under Colorado law, an HOA that takes enforcement action without legal basis can be held liable for the cost of restoration, plus the homeowner's legal fees. I attached the relevant statute number in my filing. Takeaway: in Colorado and many other states, HOA enforcement actions taken without legal authority expose the association to restoration liability. Filing with your state's HOA oversight office creates an official record that is very hard for a board to quietly make disappear. I also did something else that day, something smaller, but that would matter later. I called the contractor who'd pulled my fence posts. I got his company name off the side of his truck before he left. I looked up his business license. I called him, professional to professional, and told him I wasn't going after him. He'd been hired under false pretenses, but that I might need a written statement from him about who had authorized the work and what instructions he'd been given. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I can do that. Contractors don't like liability either." Now, here is where the situation took its first real shift in texture, a shift that I felt more than I understood at first. The HOA hearing was still 2 weeks away, but the day after the confrontation on my lawn, 2 things happened. One of my other neighbors, a retired school teacher named Berta Quill, who lived 3 lots down, knocked on my door to tell me that Gloriana had been going door to door in the neighborhood, describing the fence dispute as a property rights standoff being manufactured by a hostile resident. And 2, my front rose bushes, which sat about 4 feet inside my property line on the front yard, nowhere near the disputed fence, were found cut to the ground one morning. Clean cuts. Someone with shears who knew what they were doing. Now, I couldn't prove who'd done the roses, and I didn't immediately try to, but I did document it. Photographs, timestamps, written notes. I kept everything in a folder I labeled, somewhat grimly, The Record. Berta, it turned out, was furious. She'd lived on Creosote Ridge for 19 years and had watched Gloriana's board consolidate power through incremental intimidation for most of that time. She wasn't alone. Over the next week, in 1s and 2s, 4 other neighbors came by, or called. Nobody was ready to go to the mat publicly yet. People are people. They have mortgages, and they don't want enemies. But they were watching, and they were keeping their own records. I had WIT's survey documentation. I had the contractor's informal cooperation. I had 4 quiet allies with their own grievances. The hearing was in 11 days. And then I started reading the HOA's CC and Rs, all 47 pages, for the first time in my life, with a highlighter and a legal pad. That's where it got interesting. 47 pages of HOA covenants is not a fun weekend read. It's dense, it's full of cross-references, and large sections of it appear to have been written by someone who got paid by the semicolon. But I read every page, twice. On page 31, buried in Article 9, Section 4C, which dealt with common area access and maintenance corridors, I found the sentence that changed everything. Let me read it to you essentially verbatim, because the language matters. The association's designated primary entrance and exit corridor, including any associated signage, gate infrastructure, and landscape improvements installed thereon, must at all times be situated on parcels owned in fee simple by the association, or upon easements formally recorded in the El Paso County Public Record. Read that again slowly. The association's main entrance, the big brick and iron gateway on Creosote Ridge Road that every resident drove through every single day, the one with the bronze Heritage Homeowners Association plaque, and the pressure-washed pavers and the seasonal flower arrangements that Gloriana personally supervised, had to be on land the HOA actually owned or had a recorded easement for. I already knew how to check recorded easements. I'd paid $12 to do it once. I drove back to the county clerk's office. The HOA owned, in fee simple, 3 parcels of common area land within Mineral Springs Heritage. I wrote down all 3 parcel numbers. Then I pulled the recorded easements for HOA-related infrastructure. The main entrance, the grand brick gateway that served as the neighborhood's front door. It sat on a parcel designated as, and I want you to appreciate the bureaucratic beauty of this, Parcel 7 Delta, a narrow strip of land along Creosote Ridge Road that had been deeded to the Mineral Springs Heritage HOA in 1998 as a perpetual access easement for community identification signage. It was not a fee simple parcel. It was an easement. And easements have grantors, the person or entity who gave the easement in the first place. When I traced the chain of title on Parcel 7-Delta, I found that the easement had been granted in 1998 by the original developer of the subdivision, a company called Ridge Summit Development LLC. Ridge Summit had long since dissolved, but when they deeded out the individual lots in the development, they had transferred certain residual land rights along with specific parcels. Parcel 7 Delta's underlying fee interest, meaning the actual dirt that the HOA's entrance sat on, had been transferred in 1999 as part of the sale of the adjacent corner lot. I wrote down the parcel number of that corner lot. I looked up the current owner of record. That corner lot had changed hands twice. It had been purchased most recently, in 2018, by a man named Terrence Groff, who used it as a rental property. He lived in Denver. He had no idea that the HOA's main entrance infrastructure sat on an easement that ran across his deeded land. More importantly, and here is where the legal architecture gets genuinely elegant, the 1998 easement document contained a termination clause. Specifically, it stated that the easement was granted for the benefit of the developer and its successor HOA, but that it could be revoked by the underlying landowner in the event that the HOA failed to maintain the entrance infrastructure in compliance with county codes, or, and this part was added almost as an afterthought, in the event that the HOA was found to have materially breached its own CC&Rs in the administration of member properties. In the event that the HOA materially breached its own CC&Rs, I sat in my truck in the county parking lot for about 2 minutes, staring at that sentence. The HOA had, on video, directed a contractor to remove my fence based on an easement that did not apply to my property. They had done so before the outcome of a formally requested hearing. They had, in the process, almost certainly committed a material breach of their own covenant obligations to members. Specifically, the due process provisions in Article 6 that required an investigation and hearing before enforcement action. If someone could establish that material breach, in writing, formally, with supporting documentation, the termination clause on the entrance easement became potentially live. I didn't know if Terrence Groff would care. I didn't know if he'd ever want to invoke that clause, but I now knew it existed. I drove home. The cottonwoods were fully leafed out now. The whole street smelled green. The hearing was in 4 days. I had a lot to prepare. I want to be honest with you about something. Up until this point in the story, I had been playing defense. Documenting, filing, waiting. I had found leverage, but I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do with it. I was still thinking about this primarily as a fight to get my fence back. The hearing changed that. The formal HOA dispute hearing was held on a Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that smelled faintly of the potluck dinners it hosted every 3rd month. 5 board members sat at a folding table at the front. Gloriana sat in the center. She had a stack of papers and a look on her face that suggested she had already determined the outcome. About 30 residents attended, more than I expected. Berta was there. Whit was there. 3 other neighbors I'd spoken to over the previous week sat near the back. A few other residents I didn't recognize came in quietly and sat down. I presented my case methodically. Title abstract, survey documentation, the county easement record showing the specific lot numbers covered by the 1998 buffer easement. The video from the morning the contractor had been sent to my property. The contractor's written statement confirming he had been instructed to begin work before any formal board decision. I kept it factual. No drama, no raised voice. 22 minutes. Gloriana then presented the board's position. She cited an internal HOA map, not a county recorded document, an internal map, that purported to show the buffer easement extending to Lot 19. She cited a 2011 board resolution that she claimed clarified the easement boundaries. I asked to see the county recording number for that 2011 resolution. She said internal board resolutions didn't require county recording. I asked the board, for the record, whether they had any county recorded documentation establishing the easement on Lot 19. There was a pause long enough to become uncomfortable. The answer was no. The board voted 3-2 to table the enforcement action pending further review. It wasn't a victory. Tabling is not dismissal, but it stopped the immediate threat. The fence would stay, at least for now. But here's the thing I hadn't anticipated. After the meeting, as people were filing out, a woman named Sandra Vale, who I recognized vaguely as the owner of a townhouse near the main entrance, pulled me aside and said something that landed like a key turning in a lock. "You should know," she said, "that Gloriana has been telling people she's going to come after your workshop next. She's been saying your fabrication business is a commercial operation in a residential zone." I thanked Sandra. I walked to my truck, my workshop, my side business, custom metalwork, occasional contract jobs, weekend projects. It operated well within every county zoning exemption for residential accessory structures and home occupations. But HOACC and Rs are not county zoning ordinances. They can impose additional restrictions, and I suddenly realized I had been so focused on the fence that I hadn't fully read the CC and Rs commercial use provisions. I went home and read them that night. My workshop was fine, clearly, cleanly fine under the CC and RS language. But while I was reading those commercial use provisions, I noticed something else, something I had skimmed past during my original read. A footnote, a reference to a 2019 amendment to the CC and RS, an amendment that, according to the document, had been passed by the board without a member vote. Amendments to this particular HOA's CC and Rs required a 2/3 vote of all members, not just the board. I had just found out that one of the CC and R amendments Gloriana's board had been enforcing for 6 years might be completely invalid. The next 6 weeks were the most methodical of my adult life, and I say that as someone who once spent 4 months running a pipeline weld inspection program across 3 states. The first thing I did was contact Terrence Groff in Denver. I found his number through a property management listing. He'd rented the corner lot for years through a small agency. I called him on a Thursday morning, introduced myself as his neighbor on Creosote Ridge Road, and explained, as plainly as I could, what I'd found in the county records. I told him he owned the fee simple interest in a strip of land that the HOA's main entrance sat on. I told him about the easement termination clause. I did not tell him what I wanted him to do. I just told him what existed and sent him a PDF of the relevant documents. He called me back the same evening. Terrence Groff turned out to be a methodical man himself, a mechanical engineer who'd bought the rental lot as an investment and paid almost no attention to it beyond collecting rent. He was not angry about what I told him. He was precise. He asked clarifying questions. He said he would have his own attorney review the documents. Before he hung up, he said, "If what you're saying is accurate, this is a significant title issue. I appreciate you telling me." That phrase, significant title issue, was the sound of an engine turning over. While Terrence was consulting his attorney, I was doing 3 other things in parallel. First, I hired a real estate attorney named Claudia Fenn in Colorado Springs, a woman who specialized in HOA and property rights disputes and who had a reputation for being methodical rather than theatrical. I laid out the full picture: the fence dispute, the invalid easement, the 2019 CC&R amendment passed without member vote, and what I'd found about Parcel 7 Delta. She reviewed everything over a weekend and came back to me Monday morning with a single, clear sentence. You have enough here to file a formal complaint challenging the 2019 amendment's validity and to initiate a demand for restoration of your fence and recovery of your survey costs. She filed that complaint with the Colorado HOA Information Office within the week, officially expanding my original complaint to include the amendment challenge. Legal takeaway. In many states, including Colorado, HOA amendments adopted without the legally required member vote threshold are voidable, meaning affected members can challenge their validity in court or through the state's HOA oversight process. Always check your CC and RS amendment procedure section against your HOA's amendment history. Second, I started quietly organizing my neighbors. Not loudly, not with a group chat or a petition. Those things leak, and I didn't want Gloriana to know the shape of what was coming. I had individual conversations. I explained what I'd found about the 2019 amendment. I pointed out that several of the enforcement actions people had received, landscape fines, architectural restrictions, parking rules, had been authorized under that amendment or under the board resolutions it had enabled. If the amendment was invalid, so were those enforcement actions. Berta had been fined 4 times under rules that might not exist. Whitfield had been denied an outbuilding permit under an architectural standard that might have no legal basis. Sandra Vale had paid a special assessment in 2021 that had been authorized by the board alone. By the time I was done talking to people, I had 11 households who had signed written statements attesting to enforcement actions they'd experienced under the challenged amendment. 11 households, combined assessment and fine payments of over $4,700. Third, and this is the part that required the most patience, I worked with WIT to document the physical reality of the HOA's main entrance infrastructure as it sat on Parcel 7 Delta. We took precise measurements of the brick pillars, the gate mechanism, the sign footings, the paver apron. We photographed the existing property pins. WIT prepared a professional civil notation of exactly how much of the entrance structure crossed onto Terrence's fee simple land. The answer was almost all of it. The pillars were entirely on Terrence's parcel. The main HOA sign was on Terrence's parcel. The gate mechanism was on Terrence's parcel. Physical trap mechanic. If the easement termination clause was invoked, if someone established material breach and Terrence chose to act, the HOA would lose their legal right to maintain any of that infrastructure on his land. They'd have to dismantle it or relocate it. There was no other land on that stretch of Creosote Ridge Road where the entrance could reasonably go. The only viable alternative location, based on the existing road geometry and the HOA's own common area parcels, was a spot roughly 40 feet back from the road, which would require new permitting, new construction, and the removal of a mature landscaped berm that had taken 20 years to grow. I didn't need to touch a single brick myself. The legal architecture would do the work. Gloriana figured out that something was happening. I'm not sure exactly when. Maybe when Claudia Fenn's expanded complaint arrived at the HOA's registered agent address. Maybe when she started noticing the quiet conversations happening between neighbors on driveways and porches. But about 3 weeks after the hearing, the temperature in the neighborhood changed. The first signal was a letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Watt, who billed himself as specializing in community association law, and who wrote in a font size that suggested he wanted you to feel small reading his correspondence. The letter informed me that the board categorically denied any procedural irregularity in the 2019 amendment process, claimed the meeting minutes from that period would substantiate proper member notification, and, here was the veiled threat, noted that my pattern of filing regulatory complaints constituted potential interference with the association's lawful governance operations, and could result in counterclaims for bad faith harassment, for filing with the state regulatory office. I forwarded the letter to Claudia. She called me 20 minutes later, and I could hear the slight smile in her voice when she said, "This is what they do when they're worried. Do not respond directly. Let me handle Watt." She did. Her letter back was 4 paragraphs. It cited 3 specific Colorado statutes. It requested formally the 2019 meeting minutes and the member notification records for that amendment vote, giving the HOA 15 business days to produce them pursuant to Colorado's HOA Records Inspection Statute. Under that statute, members and their legal representatives have the right to inspect HOA meeting records. If the HOA stalls or refuses, it's a separate violation. Legal takeaway. Under Colorado Revised Statute Section 3833.3 317, HOA members have the right to inspect and copy association records, including meeting minutes. An HOA that stonewalls a legitimate records request faces additional liability. The meeting minutes arrived on the 14th business day. Claudia read them in an hour and called me back. The 2019 amendment vote had been conducted at a special board meeting. The notification had gone out by email to the HOA's distribution list. There was no record of certified mail notification to each member, no record of a published notice in a newspaper of general circulation, both of which were required under the CC and Rs for amendments. And the vote tally in the minutes listed 7 board members voting in favor, 0 against. 7 board members. The Mineral Springs Heritage HOA Board had 5 seats. Someone had recorded votes from 2 people who either didn't exist or hadn't been at the meeting. Claudia said, "This is not a technical irregularity. This is a falsified record." I sat with that for a moment, the weight of it. This wasn't Gloriana being aggressive or overreaching. This was a board that had manufactured a supermajority vote to pass an amendment they didn't have legitimate authority to pass, and then spent 6 years enforcing it against residents. Meanwhile, on the ground level of the neighborhood, the pressure campaign intensified. Someone, I was never able to prove who, filed a complaint with Mineral Springs zoning office claiming that my workshop constituted an unlicensed commercial operation. The zoning officer who came out to inspect was a quiet, thorough man named Devereaux, who walked the workshop with me for 40 minutes, looked at my home occupation permit, and told me everything was in order. He apologized for the inconvenience with the tired eyes of a man who had seen this kind of complaint before. 2 of my quiet allies, a retired postal worker named Claude Fenner and a woman named Patrice Wall, who'd lived on the street for 12 years, received letters informing them that their properties were in violation of landscape maintenance standards and that assessments would be placed if remediation didn't occur within 30 days. Both yards were immaculate. I drove past them the day those letters arrived, and there was nothing that would reasonably constitute a maintenance violation. Berta called me that evening. She was angry in the low, flat way that quiet people get when they've finally had enough. "She's going after everyone she thinks is connected to you," Berta said. "She's trying to isolate you." It was a recognizable move. Create enough ambient pressure and people back away. They have their own lives, their own peace to protect. But here's what Gloriana didn't know. Terrence Groff's attorney had finished his review of the Parcel 7 Delta documents. Terrence had called me that afternoon. He'd made his decision. He was willing to invoke the termination clause, contingent on Claudia formally establishing the material breach, which, given what the meeting minutes had just revealed, was not going to be a difficult case to make. The pieces were in place. We just needed the right moment. The right moment arrived in the form of the Mineral Springs Heritage Annual Community Meeting, held every October in the clubhouse, required by the CC&Rs, and open to all member households. It was the one event where every board decision from the prior year was subject to member review. It was the one event where a quorum of members could, under the CC&Rs, call for a binding vote. I had 6 weeks. Claudia filed the formal material breach determination with the Colorado HOA Information Office during week 1. The filing included the falsified meeting minutes, the records inspection documentation, the title abstract showing the misapplied easement on my property, the contractor's statement, and the video from the morning the fence crew had arrived. It was 51 pages of documentation, and it was, Claudia told me without vanity, one of the cleaner HOA complaints she'd assembled. The state office acknowledged receipt and assigned a case officer. Under Colorado's process, the HOA would be notified and given an opportunity to respond. But the filing was now part of the public record. If a journalist, another attorney, or a prospective homebuyer ever searched for regulatory actions against Mineral Springs Heritage HOA, they would find it. During weeks 2 and 3, I met individually with every household that had signed a statement. I brought a one-page summary that Claudia had prepared, in plain English, no jargon, explaining what the invalid 2019 amendment meant for them specifically, that the fines and assessments they had paid under it were potentially recoverable, and that a formal member vote to rescind the amendment and demand an accounting was legally within their rights at the annual meeting. I wasn't organizing a mob. I was explaining to people what their existing rights were. 14 households were now on board. That represented just over 23% of the development's 60 households. Under the CC and Rs, a petition signed by 20% of member households could force a binding agenda item onto the annual meeting. We were over threshold. Claudia prepared the petition. It had 3 demands: a member vote on the validity of the 2019 amendment, a full financial accounting of all fines and special assessments collected under board-only resolutions since 2019, and the election of an independent auditor approved by the membership rather than the board. The petition was delivered to Gloriana's HOA post office box by certified mail, and to Gerald Watt's office by messenger on the same morning, a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the annual meeting. Gloriana's response came the next day, not in writing, not through Watt. She drove to Berta Quill's house and stood on her porch for 20 minutes. Berta told me about it afterward in a voice that was steady but had something shaking underneath it. Gloriana had been, Berta said, not threatening exactly. More like she was reminding me of everything she could make difficult. She mentioned a pending approval on Berta's deck permit that the board controlled. She mentioned that Berta's daughter, who lived nearby, had a fence that might warrant measurement. When Berta told me this, I asked her if she wanted to back out. I meant it sincerely. This wasn't her fight originally, and there was a real cost to standing up in a community where you had to keep living. Berta looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has decided to stop. "Decker," she said, "I've lived here 19 years. I am not going to let that woman stand on my porch and tell me what I'm allowed to do with my deck." I contacted Terrence Groff and gave him the timeline. He confirmed he was ready. His attorney had prepared a formal notice of easement termination, grounded in the material breach documentation from Claudia's filing. Under the easement's own terms, once material breach was established and documented, the grantor's successor in interest, Terrence, could serve a 30-day termination notice. After 30 days, the HOA's legal right to maintain any infrastructure on Parcel 7 Delta would cease. The notice was ready. Terrence would serve it at the moment we determined had maximum effect. I also, and I want to be transparent about this, contacted a journalist, a woman named Reyes at the Colorado Springs Gazette, who covered municipal and community governance stories. I didn't pitch her a story. I told her I thought she might find the state HOA filing interesting, and I gave her the case number. She could look it up herself. She called me back within 48 hours and asked if she could attend the annual meeting as a member of the press. The annual meeting was in 22 days. Everything smelled like October, dry leaves and cold air and the faint diesel drift from the county road. I went to my workshop, turned on the space heater, and spent the evening at my welding bench making absolutely nothing. Just working with my hands, feeling the weight of the tools, waiting for the calendar to turn. The annual community meeting of the Mineral Springs Heritage Homeowners Association began at 6:30 p.m. on a Thursday in October, and by 6:15, the folding chairs in the clubhouse were full for the first time in anyone's memory. Word had gotten around. Not from me. I had been deliberate about keeping the specifics quiet. But in a neighborhood of 60 households, the fact that a formal petition had been delivered, that the state HOA office had an open case, that something was happening, that traveled on its own. About 42 of the 60-member households were represented. Reyes from the Gazette sat in the back row with a notepad and no camera, having been told by Gloriana's sign-in table volunteer that cameras are not permitted. She wrote that down too. Gloriana called the meeting to order. She was composed and precise. She'd clearly been briefed by Gerald Watt and was operating carefully. The standard agenda moved through financial reports, committee updates, grounds maintenance plans. She was trying to run out the clock on formality before reaching the new business section. Claudia Fenn was sitting 2 rows from the front. She had not announced herself as an attorney. She was simply there as a guest of a member. When Gloriana reached new business, she acknowledged the petition and said, in a measured voice, that the board had reviewed its terms and that, in the interest of community harmony, it had agreed to allow a member discussion, though the board reserved its position on the question of the 2019 amendment's validity. I stood up. I had a folder. I kept my voice level. I walked through it. The fence. The easement that didn't apply to my lot. The contractor sent before the hearing. The video. The 2019 amendment vote with 7 names for 5 board seats. The records inspection findings. I kept it tight. 12 minutes. No theater. I could feel the room the way you feel a current in water. People were still. The specific stillness of people who were learning something they suspected but hadn't had confirmed. When I finished, Claudia stood and identified herself. She outlined the state complaint filing and summarized the legal posture. She was precise and she was calm, and the room got even stiller. Gerald Watt, who was sitting beside Gloriana, started to speak. Claudia cited 2 statutes at him and stopped him mid-sentence. Then Berta spoke. Then Claude Fenner. Then Patrice Wall. They described their fines, their permits, their assessments. 3 more residents who hadn't been part of my group stood up on their own and described experiences I hadn't even known about. Gloriana tried twice to redirect the room to parliamentary procedure. Both times, members called the point of order back. The binding member vote on the validity of the 2019 amendment passed 31-7. In the middle of the vote count, my phone buzzed. A text from Terrence Groff. Serving the notice now. His attorney had sent the formal notice of easement termination to the HOA's registered agent address by certified mail and by email at 7 p.m., mid-meeting. The 30-day clock on the HOA's right to maintain its entrance infrastructure on Parcel 7 Delta had begun. I waited until the vote tally was announced. Then I stood back up. I said, calmly, that I wanted the board and the membership to be aware of a related property matter that would require the association's attention. I summarized, in about 90 seconds, what Parcel 7 Delta was, who owned the underlying fee interest, what the easement termination clause said, and what had just happened at 7 p.m. I put a copy of the termination notice on the table in front of Gloriana. The room was absolutely silent. Gloriana looked at the document. She looked at me, and for the first time in 11 years of watching her operate, I saw something on her face that was not composure. It was the expression of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on is not what they thought it was. Gerald Watt leaned over and looked at the document. He closed his eyes briefly. Reyes from the Gazette was writing very quickly. Nobody needed a microphone, and nobody needed a dramatic speech. The moment was the moment. A board that had manufactured votes, moved my fence by force, intimidated my neighbors, and run a neighborhood through the selective application of rules it had invented, was sitting at a folding table in a beige stucco building, looking at a document that meant their front door had 30 days to find somewhere new to live. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Several board members left quickly. Gloriana left without speaking to anyone. In the parking lot, the cottonwood leaves were coming down in the cold air, orange and dry, crunching under everyone's boots. The next 30 days were mostly procedural, which after everything that had come before felt almost restful. Gloriana Fitch resigned from the board 12 days after the annual meeting, citing personal health considerations. 3 other board members resigned within the following week. The 2 who remained, including a quiet man named Hartwell who'd been on the board for years and had, it later emerged, voted against the 2019 amendment and been outvoted and recorded as an abstention rather than a dissent, cooperated fully with the transition process. A new interim board was elected at a special member meeting, drawn from the households that had been most active in the complaint process. Berta agreed to serve temporarily as interim chair. Her exact words when asked were, "Fine, but I'm not doing the potlucks." Claudia negotiated a settlement with the HOA's liability insurer on behalf of the 14 households that had paid fines and assessments under the invalid amendment. The total recovery was just under $6,000, not life-changing money, but it was money that had been taken without legitimate authority, and getting it back mattered in the way that principle matters. My fence was rebuilt. The HOA paid for it. A surveyor staked the line. The cedar posts went back in the same holes they'd started in. Whit came over and helped, and we worked in the cold November air with the satisfying clean smell of new lumber and the solid sound of post-driver ringing, exactly the way it had sounded 11 years before. As for Parcel 7-Delta, the HOA and Terence Groff negotiated a new easement agreement, this one properly structured with clear terms and a fair annual payment to Terence for the use of his land. The old entrance infrastructure stayed in place. No brick pillars were demolished. That hadn't been the point. The point was that the association had to deal with Terence as a legitimate party with legal rights, transparently, on paper, with proper consideration. They couldn't simply occupy someone else's property by default anymore. The Colorado HOA Information Office closed its case with a formal finding that the association had violated state statute in multiple respects, including the unauthorized enforcement action on my property and the falsified amendment vote. The finding was part of the public record. Gerald Watt, for what it's worth, stopped representing the association shortly after. Now, and this is the part of the story I like to tell last, because it's the part that actually means something beyond the dispute itself. At the first legitimate annual meeting of the Reformed Board, held the following October, with a new independent auditor present and a properly noticed agenda, the membership voted to establish a community scholarship fund. Seed money came from two sources: a portion of the HOA's reserve funds that had been accumulated through the now invalidated special assessments, and a voluntary contribution from Terence Groff, who had never wanted to be anyone's adversary and who felt, as he put it, like it was the right thing to do with the easement payment. The Creosote Ridge Community Scholarship would provide one annual award to a graduating senior from Mineral Springs High School pursuing a vocational or technical certification: welding, electrical, HVAC, automotive, trades, practical skills, the kind of work that builds things that last. Berta nominated me to chair the selection committee. I accepted. Here's what I want you to take away from this. An HOA's authority is real, but it is bounded. It is bounded by its own CC and RS, by county recorded documents, by state statute, and ultimately by the legal rights of the people it governs. When an association acts outside those bounds, when it manufactures votes, misapplies easements, sends crews to your property before due process has run its course, it has exposed itself. It has created a record, and records, if you know what to look for and where to file them, are powerful instruments. $12 for a title search, certified mail on every letter, a state complaint office that actually processes filings. These are the tools. They were there the whole time.
$12. That's the part that stays with me. $12 at the county clerk's office, and 20 years of Glorina's power to start unraveling. She's done this to 4 other homeowners on that street. All 4 signed the papers and moved their fences. All because that's what petty power depends on, not force, just the assumption that you won't look. Decker looked. One title abstract, one easement termination clause nobody had ever bothered to read, and the ground her grand front gate had been standing on for 2 decades, never hers to begin with. Terence Groff had owned it in the whole town. He just didn't know it yet. 14th month later, the HOA paid to rebuild Decker's fence. The board dissolved, and the money recovered from 6 years of invalid fines became scholarship. First recipient, a kid heading to trade school for welding. I don't think that was an accident. So let me ask you something. Do you actually know where your property line is? Have you ever pulled your title abstract? Because somewhere out there, someone like Gloriana is counting on the fact that you haven't. Share this with one neighbor, not for the drama, because someone on your street needs to know that they have the right to check. Like, subscribe, and drop your HOA story below. The most dangerous power isn't the kind that comes with a badge. It's the kind that comes with a laminated notice and assume you won't fight back.